Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm delighted to be joined by returning guest Baber Farooq, the Senior Vice President Market Strategy for Procurement Solutions at SAP. Now, as you may be aware, we've worked closely with Baber and his team at SAP recently to create the Procurement of Services study. We also wrote a paper dissecting the results of a recent study SAP commissioned Economist Impact to create with a mid-market focus. But in today's conversation, Baber and I chatted more specifically about how procurement leaders can approach optimizing their source-to-pay strategy. Baber and SAP see probably more source-to-pay implementations than any other company, so I wanted to tap into that experience to ask questions about source-to-pay optimization, the current trends that are driving new ideas, and the timeless suite versus best-of-breed debate. So let's go into the conversation where I ask Baber to give us an overview of the current challenges he sees that procurement leaders face in optimizing their source-to-pay processes.
I think challenges that procurement faces are a very strong representation of the macroeconomic challenges that the economy is. And it's so interesting how every aspect of a business in some ways ends up reflecting on the larger state of the economy, right, at some point in time. But I think with procurement, it's very immediate. So when we look at procurement organizations today and what their challenges are, I think they are very strongly hit by the uncertainty around interest rates, the volatility that still continues with inflation, and therefore measures around cost savings, around managing risk. They have become top of mind. And what's really interesting is that we've done a few, Phil, how we keep doing market research surveys, and we keep and it's really interesting where you noticed where you ask two questions to the sample set, right? Which is, what's your priority right now, right? What's the priority right now? And then you ask another question, well, what's your priority in 3 to 5 years time, right? And in times where you are dealing with inflation and economic uncertainty, you sort of get very quickly, cost containment is a priority right now, right? Risk management is a priority right now. And then some of those strategic pillars that procurement always has wanted to make a dent on, and it has made progress and definitely made progress in the past years, right? Such as supplier diversification, such as sustainability. Those get ranked highly in the 3 to 5 years as compared to the now to the next 18 months, right? So I think you're seeing that manifest itself a lot more today. And it's not that customers do not want to have the conversations that are more strategic, but at the same time, there's a business reality. The CFO's knocking on the door, right? And there's clearly this shift to saying, okay, what are the things that are going to immediately allow me to deliver benefits on, cost savings, managing risk, and making sure that supply can be as continuous as possible in the immediate sense right now. And then when you think about that, and you think about that third point that I mentioned around ensuring supply, or even frankly, if you think about the first 2 points, those are the business priorities. But when they translate to technology priorities, that technological translation, I think, used to be sort of like, oh, run reverse auctions or you do. But like, I mean, people that lemon has been squeezed so many times at this point that, and suppliers know how to handle their customers as well from that perspective. So there's a lot more emphasis. Actually, the number one sort of area that we see, and we started seeing this last year, but it's continued definitely into this year. The number one area where we see as the technology imperative that's going to deliver on these business benefits is spend analytics.
Interesting.
Spend analytics, category management, that's been up, on the up and up for sure for the past couple of years. But spend analytics has, I think when we looked at this question a few years ago, it was number 6 or so, and now it's number 1, right? And even if you think about it, when we talk about artificial intelligence and generative AI, you know, a lot of that is also, I mean, all of that is fueled by data, right? So it is, in some sense, make me interpret all this data that I have in a manner that makes sense to me, right? Is what the focus on artificial intelligence and the focus on spend analytics is pointing out to people, right?
So do you see from a spend analytics perspective, because, I feel like we've talked about spend analytics for a lot of years in procurement.
Yes.
Is that both from those that maybe historically have not invested in spend analytics, or they've looked at some homegrown system and they're now realizing, you know what, I need to get a better grip of what my spend analytics looks like? Or is it those that have invested in spend analytics but perhaps need to take that to the next level, or that what they have done before has not necessarily given them the predictive data that they may have wanted to see? Kind of, how do you see, where is the focus on spend analytics?
It's a great question. I think with spend analytics, Phil, you know, I mean, when I first joined Ariba 20 years ago, we had a solution called Spend Analytics. So
Right.
it's not new as in terms of the problem statement, right? But it's been hard. It's hard work, right? If you want to like take data and you want to throw it into an analytics tool, and there's refreshes that need to happen, and I think what people are saying when they say this is that it just needs to be easier. It needs to be much more automated. And then when you start talking about the artificial intelligence aspect of it, they say that, well, and it should just proactively tell me what I should be looking for, right? And so I think, yes, there's definitely people that maybe have underinvested in this space in the past, or they've just had this massive data warehouse that they can tap into if they need to, but they need to know how to set up the data for spend reporting. They need to ask the right questions. They need to query it properly. And that's a lot of work, right? There are probably teams out there that maybe have spend reporting sorted out in one source system, but don't have it sorted out in another source system. And spend can sit in many systems. But then there's also teams that actually have maybe invested a lot of money in using the various tools that are out there to have dashboards set up and have it, but it's still a lot of work to process the data at a time where the amount of data we have access to has been exponentially increasing. Right.
And data quality at scale has not necessarily truly been solved for, has it? So it's kind of the trust in that information as well. I imagine that even getting from I have no visibility to, I have 80% confidence in the data that I'm seeing, getting further than that is kind of an exponential increase in resources to have 90%, 100% confidence in the data. And that's sometimes where procurement struggles, is presenting the data, and those that are skeptical taking that as an excuse to say, well, I'm going to poke a few holes in this because it's not 100%. Procurement's challenged with that.
100%. I think there's two other interesting aspects of it. Well, one is, I mean, like when we talk about, as technologists, when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's this phrase called the last mile of AI, right? Which is that to get it absolutely right, that last bit requires like 100x times of resources to just. So, and I think that translates to the sort of problem statement on spend analytics, that getting to 100% confidence on trusting the data, requires a lot more resources. From the customer's perspective, from the technology's perspective. But I think what's also interesting, Phil, around what you were saying, is that we have evidence around us in the world that we live in where data is being mined and processed at scale, right? And some of it is scary, right? When we see, I mean, we've heard of these instances and situations where like, oh, well, I was just talking and apparently Siri must have listened to what I was saying and an ad on Instagram for this, and there's these instances people talk about it.
Too many coincidences when you look on your phone.
right? Now whether that's happening or not is not obviously the topic, but
Yeah.
the point is that people see evidence of data processing at scale
Yeah.
in the consumer world, in the world around us, right? We've talked about, unfortunately, how elections have been manipulated by
Yeah.
data at scale, right? So then I think it sort of subconsciously also feeds this idea, well, I should certainly be able to get a spend report
Mhm.
if all this is happening, right? Now, why is that so hard, and why is all this, all this, effervescent present of technology that's around me possible when this, just doing business reporting is so difficult?
Mhm.
And there's many reasons to that. Partly it's because we are, thank goodness, much more careful about the way data is handled. That's, you know for business oriented data than, unfortunately, sometimes we are on everyday data that's surrounding our lives, right? um you know uh, but I think that evidence that we see feeds this idea that, hey, I should be able to do a lot more with this data that's out there, and I'm clearly not getting the benefits and the results, and I'm having to do too much, and my teams are having to do way too much work getting an answer to a question that, wow, I wish I could just type into a chatbot, right? That's it. There's an element of that, I think, that does end up feeding the belief
Yeah.
of organizations as to what should be possible.
How do you think that that's ultimately solved for?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think, firstly, I think there's a lot of things that are solvable today, right? In
Mhm.
terms of, SAP is one provider. Obviously, we think we're solving this not well, but just if you speak holistically outside of, SAP as well, I think the tools that exist in the market, we just recently released Spend Control, or are about to release Spend Control Tower. That sort of hits this exact point.
Mhm.
Are much easier to deploy, much more automated in terms of the way they function, and they automatically import data from sources, right? So the entire that effort, the upfront effort, I think, as technology keeps improving, is going to keep reducing. At the same time, I think we also need to take a little bit of a pause and be realistic about what is it going to mean from an AI perspective when we apply it to
Mhm.
data that corporations have proprietary rights on, right? A lot of the magic we see that happens with AI is when data is being shared, cross-shared, and the algorithms are being trained
Yeah.
at a massive, massive
Yeah.
scale, right? Not just from one data source, but from data sources that are in the thousands sometimes, right? And when we talk about ethical AI, and a very large portion of that is making sure that we move responsibly in that direction, right? You know, if there's an algorithm that we're training, can both customer X and customer Y's data be used to train that algorithm?
Mhm.
Right? We don't have answers to all these
Yeah.
questions yet. But these are important
Yeah.
questions to ask in terms of how this is going to end up evolving. So the basic analytics of it, I think, is a much more solvable problem now, and you can do a lot more faster, and that's going to keep improving. The automation and the artificial intelligence and how it applies here, I think we will be very careful and deliberate, and over time, I think we will move in the direction of solving all these problems, but we need to just be measured as to how we approach it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's
You know?
interesting. Previously, you talk a lot about anonymizing and aggregating data, and some organizations would let you do that, some organizations wouldn't. But it was in the because I would have this when I was on the services side, but it was in the generally seen as I provide my information. It's again aggregated, anonymized. I get benefits from seeing the results of that. But now there's a lot more awareness probably, and a lot more kind of regulation process, or not processes, but policies within organizations about the sharing of their information, which actually makes that a lot harder because you're a lot more reticent to share that information. Whereas 5-10 years ago, you may be more open to sharing that into, a more of a central repository.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I think, um, in some sense, in some weird sense, as we see the power of technology,
Mm-hmm.
the more and more apprehensive we get
Yeah.
about how much information it should have. That is certainly an
What's all the
aspect.
derivatives that I haven't even thought about for this information?
there's a risk component to it. And the way we see it reflected in terms of our business is, you asked me about trends, right? One of these trends, 100% is around spend analytics, delivering cost savings, we're providing insights to action, we call it sometimes, that the system can tell, and that requires data. The other very interesting trend is the amount of regulatory data governance
Yeah.
that we're dealing with right now, in terms of countries that are setting up, that want data centers only to be within their boundaries. They want to make sure that we provide certain guarantees about who can access that data when they're not in that country. And I'm not even talking about like defense, in the defense industry. I'm talking
Right.
about general,
Yeah.
right?
What used to be just company policy is now becoming regulated.
Yeah, regulated. It's becoming country regulated, right? And it's very difficult to navigate even the legalese of this, on what it means for procurement data, right? Because they're not necessarily targeting it as procurement data. It will be called payment information, will be called something generic, but does it apply to procurement? All that has to be understood. So there is this fear that exists in general, broadly speaking, right? If you look at it from a regulatory perspective, about especially when we talk about everything going on in the world, about who has access to the data. And at the same time, we know that to make these models better, you need to give them more access to data, right? So I think, and that's why I think the way we move on this from a business perspective has to be measured and very responsible. And SAP has definitely made that commitment. And we term it as, obviously, ethical AI, or responsible AI, right? Where we from a technology perspective, we are completely all in on this, right? We 100% are. We're throwing everything in the kitchen sink to make sure that we have the best available technology and the partnerships to deliver on this promise. But from the perspective of making sure that we are responsible for the way data is used, especially the data that our customers have in our cloud, we're being very, very measured, right? And I think that tension is a healthy tension, that it is necessary to deliver the right outcome at the end. Right? So it might make more time. It might take more time, sorry, than than what we might experience on when we're looking at all the amazing analytics that are impacting us on social media. But I think the end result of it is much more powerful because of the nature of the work we're talking about.
How about in the category management space? So we talked about spend analytics as being something that, where it's continuing to, the ability of spend analytics platforms are continuing to increase to get greater confidence in the quality of the data. Category management is one of these areas that, from a technology perspective, I think fairly curiously, there was never that much investment in product on that side. Just as an industry, we always focused on sourcing. We focused on spend and focused on sourcing. But the bit in the middle of the strategy was the bit that sometimes got missed. And I know that over the past probably 3-4 years, there's been more investment in the technology in that side just from across the market. But do you see that that's continuing, that AI is going to be a driver of helping from a strategy side, as opposed to, kind of understanding spend and then going and transacting the spend?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it is a little bit related to the spend analytics bill, right? We've certainly, if there's three things SAP is investing in right now, right, from a procurement perspective, it's spend analytics, it's category management, and it's the application of artificial intelligence across the source to pay suite. Like, those are the three things that, in a nutshell, make up where the bulk of our investments are going. We obviously released a category management tool last year because we saw it moving in this direction. And I think category management is not new. Right, it has existed since before I was, had entered my working life. But what is new is this idea that, hey, there's probably a little bit of, hey, we've lost the art, right, to do it properly. But I think beyond that, it would always be something that was done manually, right, and it would be in presentations and spreadsheets, and measuring up against how you were performing to goals on category management was always a challenge, right? And it would always, again, be done manually. Let's go offline. This was what we said what we would do. This is how we wanted to measure it. Let's go measure it. And I think the idea that we're seeing is that again, in this digitized world, it should really be a lot easier, right? If I have a source to pay system, I should be able to tell that source to pay system what my goals are.
Yeah.
It should potentially even recommend goals to me. It should be able to tell me how I'm going to measure these goals and target these goals. Sustainability is a great example. I can have goals on scope 3 emissions, right? You know, and then I should be able to see how I performed against the goals that I ended up setting, right?
Yeah.
The system should be able to do it without me going offline and doing a bunch of things, right? Within category management, I mean, I think we're seeing there's a lot of focus on should cost analysis, right? We're also seeing a lot of focus on scenario planning, right?
Yeah.
It's the biggest thing that's popped up recently, as
Interesting.
scenario planning being a huge focus for what a category management tool should enable us to do. And what's also interesting is that category management is one of those things when we where we have it's one of the first areas where we've invested in generative AI technology into, right? And a big reason we were able to do that is because, you know, when you're doing a lot of the analysis that you do for category management, sometimes you are just searching the public internet, right? You don't need to necessarily be digging deep into proprietary data or just something that has access to proprietary data, right? And that it gave us a lot of flexibility, like when you're setting up crawling matrices and whatever, to say, hey, could we end up gathering intelligence? Of course I can use a tool that can give me category intelligence, but if I don't have access to a tool that gives me category intelligence, how would I do it? I could just take a best effort guess at it, pulse a few people, or I could actually use generative AI technology that does go ahead and tap the public internet and get a perspective that'll be better than my guess, right? So that's sort of the first ways we're tackling generative AI in category management.
Interesting. So kind of bringing in public information. I smile when you're talking because I think about the number of hours that I spent Googling for information and building category plans and building category strategies earlier in my career. It's also really interesting. And I think it's really positive that you're seeing such interest in scenario planning. The reason being, well, it was a comment I was going to make right up front as you were talking about cost savings and risk being so important. Cost savings are becoming a part of risk management as opposed to them being two disparate things. There's other risks to mitigate and manage and to kind of do trade-offs around, as opposed to thinking that you can necessarily have both. But scenario planning is something we've always struggled with, or almost not had the bandwidth and the time to really think through what are all the realms of what can happen and the realms of possibilities to then make decisions based around scenarios. Instead, it's more been around gut feel. So I'm just interested if you can talk a little bit more about what that scenario planning kind of looks like and some of the inputs that kind of go into driving what those different outputs may be.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a large reason for why scenario planning is gaining so much importance from a category management perspective is because we live in a very, very volatile world. And I think people have been caught off guard, and I'm not even talking about the pandemic, because I'm not talking about 1 in 100-year events. I think those are very difficult to scenario plan, and I would argue it can't realistically be the job of organizations. It's more the job of governments, in my opinion, to plan for. But I mean, even 1 in 5, 1 in 10-year events, right? Whether it's natural disasters, which are happening more and more, unfortunately, whether it's supply chain disruptions that are happening more and more, whether it's also, I mean, there seemed to just be this belief that interest rates would never rise. There was this belief out there in the world that they would never rise, right? And it's like, belies like 500 years of history. So, these things were not planned for, and I think people have realized that. And all these factors end up influencing the amount of money we're going to pay, the availability of supply, right? So how do you scenario plan all these different factors, and then see what could the outcome be to a potential category strategy if one happens versus the other, right? Because a lot of the times, for example, if I just use this example, when because of the pandemic, there was so much cash being pumped in by central banks into global economies, particularly the G7 countries. And for good reason, obviously, right? We all know why it was done. There were many, many, many economists in the world that were saying, hey, this can cause significant inflation, right? That could have been scenario planned, right? Scenario planned that sort of a scenario, right? And said, okay, well, if this ends up happening, then obviously the most logical answer, interest rates will rise. That is going to have these sort of
Mhm.
consequences. You could scenario plan that both from a cost perspective and a supply perspective, right? It also is interesting how it would have a different aspect and an impact on goods versus services,
Yeah.
with the impact on services for inflation lagging behind goods, right? And then stabilizing, and then price of oil, all these things that end up impacting um, really, weekly, monthly costings for organizations could be planned better so that organizations are better prepared. I think, when you talk about scenario planning and category management, it's in some ways another way of saying, but do better risk management,
Yeah.
right? And again, I think there's this belief that, God, there must surely be a better way to do this now, right? And not in terms of necessarily the methodology, but just the access to the tools and the data we have. We must be able to do this better.
Mhm.
Um, which again, no tool exists right now, and that's sort of what we have seen and has been one of the reasons we've been driven in this direction.
I think it's interesting to me as we think about doing this at scale. So when I again think back to a world when I certainly didn't have access to really any technology in building category strategies,
Yeah.
and so it's a lot of interpretation. It's some experience. It's reading up on different possibilities, and you're always looking at what's going to happen in 3 or 5 years. I would always say that category strategies, building category management really is
Mhm.
dependent upon the capability of individuals as opposed to the infrastructure around an individual in kind of building the strategy, at least up until now, because it depends your personal relationships, your ability to gather data, your ability to interpret the data, and then make good judgments on that information. You can't scale that. You might have some superstars in your team that can do it, and then they leave, and it's hard to replace that. So what's interesting to me now is as we're looking at technology and thinking, how do I scale some of these things based on what individuals did as best practices before? And that's where you start thinking about the impact that procurement can have, and kind of 10xing the impact of procurement, because it's not reliant on any one specific, a high performer in your organization. Yes, a high performer can take that and do great things with it, but you're not as kind of strong as your weakest link, so to speak, when it comes to the perception of the procurement team as a whole.
That's a brilliant point, Phil, for multiple reasons. Really, it's a beautiful point. I mean, I think, you know, I didn't mention this at the start, but one of the trends that you do see and you do hear from procurement organizations is that, I need to make sure I keep, you know, hiring the best talent
Mhm.
and hiring talent that is prepared for the world of tomorrow, potentially different skills, right? And data analytic skills, I think, are increasingly more and more important for the procurement profession than they have been in the past. But it also leads to another really interesting point that's tied to, arguably why artificial intelligence is such a necessary technology as we move forward, which is that, um, the global population is aging
Mhm.
and shrinking.
Yeah.
Right. So people are getting older. Baby boomers are, heading into retirement, and the population is not and has not been growing at that same rate. So, in other words, it's going to affect the labor pool significantly. We just don't have as many workers, right?
Mhm.
So the competition for talent is going to keep increasing, right? Despite all the doomsday scenarios on AI that are out there. I mean, I personally don't think they're realistic in the short term, right? But overall, the talent shortage is going to be something that keeps impacting organizations more and more, especially as this trend continues. Uh, and not only is it that there's less people, right? But they certainly will not have the skills of the people who have just retired after 20, 30
Yeah.
years of service. And all that amazing knowledge that's in their heads goes out the window, which means that even if you build it up, you have to build it up in a manner that's much more transferable and scalable,
Yeah.
right? Which is where technology can play a
Yeah.
part, right? And that's a very, uh, a significant undercurrent in all of this, right? As we build these tools out there, that we're not building them necessarily to just deliver an outcome, but we're also building it so that it facilitates transferability and scalability
Yeah.
for an organization as we move forward. Because the workforce that it has now is not anywhere close to the workforce it will have 10 years from now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Problems will most likely be the same, if not having become even more significant.
For anyone who's been involved in procurement the last couple of years, there's been a trend towards intake and intake management. Is that something that is here to stay, do you feel? And do you look at that as being kind of a best of breed technology capability, or something that ultimately is going to be a part of the larger kind of suite, if you will, of procurement tech?
It's a really good question, Phil. I mean, I think intake management, orchestration, I think fundamentally it's a demand for simpler UX, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where it comes. And I think we looked at this problem and we've wondered, like, well, wow, we're investing a lot of money in UX. Where did this come from? There's a little bit of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's what I realize, it's not about our UX actually, right? It's about when you think about business users, most of them that are casual users, um, the landscape, the technology landscape in any company, especially large companies, even the procurement technology landscape is increasingly heterogeneous, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we would love everyone to only run SAP software,
Yeah.
right? But the reality is that it's heterogeneous. Some things that they'll be using our partners for, some things they'll be using our competitors for, some things they'll be using other companies for that where we're not sort of we don't have a product to solve
Or
a
they
certain
may have
problem.
built themselves. They maybe homegrown.
Exactly right. It's something they build themselves, and with the power of all these, beautiful platforms that are out there and no code technology that's out there, that dirty word customization isn't that dirty anymore, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
do have niche requirements that can be fulfilled by in-house tools and products in a very simple way, but it's still a different tool. So that technology landscape is overwhelming for an end user sometimes, right? So sometimes you're just like, okay, I just need to do this. So where do I go to do this, right? So I do think in that sense it's best of breed to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Because I think if for example SAP built capability in this domain, we would need for it to not just be about SAP software, right?
Because they need to connect with so many other different things.
I mean, if we build, I mean, and this is why I think some people are confused. Initially, we're like, well, we have this front end but it's only for SAP software,
Yeah.
of course, right? So it needs to be broader than that. So now that recognition exists, and we're looking at it very closely. We have a couple of partnerships that are already out there. We do think that the trend is real, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that's only a temporary hype. I don't think so. So we're looking at it from our perspective about how much we invest, and how much maybe we go deeper into some partnerships as well in the future.
Interesting. It's definitely something that we see a lot of, and I do think we'll continue to see. And I think the point that you made right at the beginning of that is about user experience, and that's really what we're trying to make. How do we make the procurement process, the access to the technology, as simple and as easy as possible for all users, depending upon thousands and thousands and thousands of different individual use cases.
And in this case, the UX problem statement isn't about it being a nice looking UX or
no,
a simple UX or a UX that it's about literally, well, what if I have 25 pieces of the 25 tools I can go to?
yeah,
Where do I even begin? Right?
yeah,
Like that UX problem statement.
yeah.
And you know what's funny, Phil? Is funny is that I even think AI at the end of the day is a UX problem statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, if you have the perfect tool that you can talk to or text to, you don't need to log into a system,
No,
right? So it is also a user experience problem statement in the most general sense. Yeah.
I'm a big believer in that, and that the next in-demand skill set will be prompt engineering, and
Oh, yeah,
and,
exactly.
and figuring out how to ask for it, because now all this information and data, when we go back to data, all available, but can you remember how to run the report that does X, Y, and Z every single time? Not really, but if you can just ask it, then it will suddenly untap, I think, access to all of this information and present it in ways that hasn't been presented, and that alone can drive differentiated decision making, which is something that we're always talking about is a really big thing for procurement.
Asking the right question is a big skill, And it's a big skill, outside of prompt engineering. Like,
Yep.
can you ask the right question to get the
Yep.
right answer, right? Define the problem statement correctly. And I think, as they refer to prompt engineering, as things evolve in the space of artificial intelligence, I think it becomes more and more important to say, are you asking the right question?
Yeah.
It's sort of, all this, it just takes, it's funny because for the longest time, people have been like, oh, I want an Amazon.com experience. I want an Amazon.com experience. And it's just kind of backwards, right? I mean, Amazon's business model is, in the consumer world, to keep you on Amazon.com
Mm-hmm.
as long as they can, so you
Yeah.
keep shopping, right? Like that's the idea. We want the opposite. I want you
in and out. Don't look for anything else.
I can have you not enter the tool
Yep.
and the work is done. That's the ideal outcome,
Yep.
right? When we talk about the business scenario, right? So that's why, the way AI gets used, right, in the corporate setting is also different from the way, in the ideal sense, they will get used in a personal setting, consumer setting.
Well, Baber, I know it's about time to wrap up. I know we're going to try and connect again shortly to review all the latest data from the Economist survey that you've been running this year. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of those insights and seeing how they changed from last time. But until then, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on the pod again today. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.